I'm going to be talking today very specifically about one of these sustainable development goals. We're going to talk about 12.3, which is our goal to reduce food waste by 50% by 2030, and some of the opportunities in the technology space that we see really exciting potential for in solving that problem. Just a quick introduction to ReFed. I imagine not all of you have heard of us before. We are a relatively small nonprofit, but we are focused on reducing food waste here in the US. We have three primary areas of work that kind of guide our programming. The first is around data and insights. So really bringing all the data together on food waste and then disseminating that in ways that leads to action and solving the problem of food waste. Second is capital and innovation. We need about $14 billion annually to solve the problem of food waste. So this is about bringing in that catalytic capital, those first dollars in, high risk investments in order to solve the problem, and then elevating innovators and innovations to be ready to use that capital at scale. And then finally, stakeholder engagement. Food waste is a problem, as you'll see here in a little bit, that spans the entire supply chain. So we need players from across that supply chain and even beyond the food system to come into the big tent, so to speak, and work together to solve this problem. So what is the problem we're talking about? On a global scale, we waste about 1/3 of all food produced, which is a staggering number. To kind of apply that into our daily lives, I mean, think about going to the grocery store, buying 3 bags of groceries and throwing one out before you even get to your car. And that's kind of a laughable behavior, right? Something that none of us would consider doing, but in reality, that's what's happening between the farm and our homes every single day with the food that we produce. And it's an enormous waste of resources, financial, environmental, and otherwise. So $1 trillion value globally associated with that waste, and 8% of our global greenhouse gas emissions. If we look a little closer to home here in the US, it's about 35% that goes uneaten, so just a little bit higher than global average. $408 billion a year, it's about 2% of our US GDP, and 40 million Americans are food insecure. We've obviously seen that number grow over the past couple of years between COVID and inflation and supply chain challenges that we've faced. And this is one of the things that I really appreciate about food waste as a topic, is that everyone can find a connection point to it somehow. We are all consumers, we all eat food, but then it connects to so many of these other economic, environmental, and public health issues that there's a reason for everyone to care. So in addition to this economic and public health food access issue, it's also an environmental issue. So it's 4% of our US greenhouse gas emissions. Food is the #1 material by volume in our landfills. About 24% of our landfills are made up of food. And those greenhouse gas emissions are about the same as 48 million cars, so 21% of our cars on the road. What if we were to solve food waste? What if we were to actually reduce our food waste by 50% by 2030? I won't read through all these impacts, but a couple that I particularly find interesting. One is biodiversity. We can reduce our biodiversity loss by 17%. This is mostly associated with converting less land to agricultural land. We can preserve land greater than the state of Arizona. This is really important from a carbon standpoint when we talk about how soil can actually pull carbon out of the air and reduce global warming effects that we're seeing. And then finally, 73 billion in net financial benefit. That's not a small number. And I talk about how we need 14 billion every year to make progress. This is a pretty good return on investment when we talk about the impacts of actually reducing that waste. So where is it happening? As I said, food waste is a systemic issue. It is happening all the way from farm to fork. We really can't pin it on a certain point in the supply chain. Consumers are responsible for most, about 37% of that happening within our households. Consumer-facing businesses are not too far behind. That obviously spans across retail, restaurant, food service, et cetera. And then back on farm, 21%. What's I think staggering about that is more than half of that is edible. It's either being left in the field because it's not marketable, even though it's edible, it doesn't look right, or we don't have the labor to pick it because of labor shortages that we're facing, or a whole host of number of issues. But half of that food is edible and we're not getting it off the farm. I think maybe just one other point I'll make on this slide is that because it is systemic in nature, it's easy to say 21% of food waste is associated with farm, but the solutions to that may not be on farm, right? Because the reason that food goes to waste could be because of decisions happening at retail. You think about produce specifications. A retailer will say, hey, tomatoes have to be this big and this color or else we don't buy them. That drives waste on farm. But a retailer sets those specifications because that's how we as consumers spend our dollars. They know what we want when we come into their stores because they can tell if we buy it or not. So decisions that happen throughout the entire supply chain are really driving waste throughout the entire supply chain as well. So it is a complicated issue that obviously needs those multifaceted approaches that Uwe already talked about earlier this morning. So let's talk about a little of the resources and the data that we work with as well. Like, we don't want to focus only on the doom and gloom of the problem. There are solutions out there and there are huge opportunities to advance solutions. So we started with a very static resource when Refed was founded back in 2015, but acknowledging the really fast changing landscape and progress that was happening, we wanted to have something more digital and customizable and live. So this led to two different resources that are publicly available now. The first is the roadmap to 2030. This is our blueprint for action. When people say, how do we actually get to 50% reduction by 2030? This is where we point them. And there are 7 key action areas here. These are meant to guide various stakeholders, businesses, policymakers, academics, et cetera, on where to focus their efforts and resources. We've modeled over 40 different specific solutions to food waste. And by modeled, I mean we've looked at the economic, environmental, and social costs and benefits of those solutions. And those fit under these. So those are the actual actionable things that can happen to reduce food waste. So a few examples that would fit under here: farm labor matching software. How do we get laborers to farms that have excess produce that needs to be picked? AI ordering technology. I'll talk more about that in a minute, actually. And then donation matching software. How do we help donors and donation recipients reduce the logistical barriers that are in between them and move that product quickly? So there are very actionable solutions that fit under each of these 7 action areas. Then we have our insights engine. If the roadmap is kind of the high level summary of here's the actions, the insights engine is where you go to geek out on all the data and all the assumptions that feed up to that roadmap. So this insights engine, and it is a linkable. So when I share these slides, you can click on the purple bar here to dive into it. But there are 6 different tools in here. The first is a food waste monitor. This tells you how much food is going to waste, what type of food it is, why it's being wasted, where it's going. You can break that down by state. You can break that down by which KPI you're most interested in. Is it by pounds or by GHG impact or by water impact? We have the ability to explore the solution, so a solution database where you can see what are those 40 plus solutions that we've modeled and the economic, environmental, and social implications of those. Then we have a solution provider directory. This is your yellow pages of who's working in this space if you're looking for partners. The impact calculator lets you determine what type of impact you are having or could be having by implementing various solutions. The capital tracker shows you where is capital coming from right now. Is it enough? What is the gap? Where does it need to be coming from? And track some of those capital flows over time. And then finally, the policy tracker. This lets you look at what active or pending policies related to food waste are occurring across the country, comparing different policies by state, and then understanding what barriers may exist for solutions based on policies that are existent in those states. So this tool is about 2 years old. We're doing a massive overhaul actually right now in preparation for a relaunch in April, where we'll update all of our data over the last 2 years as well. With that, I wanted to spend just my last couple minutes talking about some of the areas where we see a lot of momentum and opportunity for solutions to food waste related to technology. I could name 20 of them, I think. I have 4 or 5 in here just to kind of talk through very quickly to give you a taste of what we're talking about. So the first is in temperature monitoring the cold chain. Food has to move long distances because of that globalization that we're facing today. And so ensuring the integrity of that cold chain is really important. That's what determines how long the shelf life of that product has when it hits the store. If it's exposed to unknown variables or heat in the supply chain, it's compromised, it can shorten shelf life and go to waste before it ever gets where it's meant to be going. So there's a lot of progress in trackers and other technologies that are monitoring that constantly throughout the entire supply chain, even as it changes hands from one to another. One of my personal favorites that I'm getting to work a lot with right now is machine learning and inventory management. This is all about AI technologies that basically kind of let you know how many apples will I sell as a retailer on a rainy Tuesday in Cleveland, right? So it takes in all this data based on my previous sales, based on weather patterns, based on holidays and consumer purchasing. to help really kind of inform best purchasing practices for retailers to minimize waste. We just ran a pilot with this with some retailers on the West Coast, and they saw almost a 15% reduction per store in those pilots. And we would see over 900,000 tons of food waste reduced every year if the whole retail sector implemented these solutions. So really high impact potential here. Third is image recognition for waste tracking. This is primarily in a food service and restaurant environment, where basically as I'm throwing food into the trash or into the compost, image recognition is telling me how much of it is being wasted and what type of food it is. So I have real-time data on what's happening in my kitchen. And then finally, markdown alert applications. This is more consumer facing. So you and I can open our phones and use one of these apps to get access to food in our community that would otherwise be going to waste, either overproduced in a restaurant or nearing its expiration date in a retail store. And we can buy that for a discounted price, which is great for our wallets. And it's also reducing food waste. So to close in my last minute here, how are we doing on this goal? We have a goal to reduce food waste by 50% by 2030. What's the progress report? A train moves very quickly, so we need to slow that train, obviously, before we can start reversing that train. So after increasing nearly 12% in the first part of this last decade, the amount of surplus food, which is all that food that goes uneaten or unsold, has leveled off starting in 2016 and now started to decline. So we've seen a 2% decrease per capita in food waste since our baseline year. It's great that it's heading that direction. This is also 2019 data. So when we do our data update in April, we'll see what the impacts of COVID were. COVID rocked our supply chains globally. So I think depending on sector, we'll see different trends of food waste increasing some places and food waste decreasing some places. So stay tuned for April and we'll see what that looks like. But we did start to see a decline before COVID hit, which is obviously heading in the right direction, but it is not heading fast enough. And we certainly need to be doing more. And so invite all of you to be part of that solution with us. And with that, I'll wrap up.
Thank you, Jackie. All right. Do you have a few questions or a few minutes for Q&A?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Does anyone have questions yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I just want to say thank you so much for the presentation. It was really inspiring and informative. My question, you mentioned how households are the largest contributors to food waste, and I wanted to offer the problem of school lunch food waste. Especially in my county, I've seen like there's like requirements where you have to get like milk and a fruit, but some kids will walk out of the lunch line and immediately throw that away. So I was like wondering, how would you recommend that we address that problem in schools itself? Because I think that would also make a really good impact on the problem itself.
Yes, you are absolutely correct. School food waste is a big problem. And if you were to look at those 40+ solutions that we have, there are a few that are related to schools as well. There's a few things. There are certainly conversations that can be had about the contracts that schools have with their food providers as far as the type of food that they're getting, changing rules that like kids don't all have to get milk, for example. Another really low-tech solution we've seen really work well is something called share tables, where basically they put these tables out in the eating area and everyone who doesn't want their milk or whatever comes in the lunch line, they put it on those tables and other people can go get it for free. So there are some pretty low-tech solutions there. I think there's a lot of opportunity from a policy standpoint. A lot of the school decisions on lunches are determined by policy, right, at the federal level. So I think we need to be having those conversations. There are policies that were well intended, right, to have more nutritious lunches, but those policies in the way that they're written require a lot of behaviors that end up leading to waste, like forcing kids to take certain types of food. So you're absolutely right. I think there's a lot of conversations that need to happen there. And student engagement is actually the most successful approach to that. Students standing up and saying, hey, we don't like this behavior, we want to not feel pressured to be wasting food, is where we see the most influence happening, driving to change.
Thank you. All right. Do we have any other questions?